Hello, I'm Phil Shipley, and I'm an Assistant Director in the Residence Life Office here at WVU. I work with the community standards for our residence halls and the residence life conduct process. And those topics will be the emphasis of this presentation. As you review this presentation, I would encourage you to write down any questions that you may have. After this presentation, you should share your questions with your supervisor, and they will be able to assist you with finding answers. As you know, as a result of COVID-19, we've had to make several changes to our typical process. These changes are still ongoing, and some things may even change after this training has been recorded. We will do our best to ensure that you receive updated information as it becomes available. As a result of going through this training, you should be able to do the following. Explain the importance and reason for our community standards of conduct. Communicate your role as it relates to engaging with and educating students in our community. Describe the departmental expectations for addressing concerns within your community, and also be able to articulate the general understanding of the conduct process. Now let's talk about our residential community. Our residence halls are more than a dorm. They are our home and support system for our students. The word dorm comes from the Latin word dormitus, which means to sleep. As you know, much more happens in college than classes and sleeping, and much of that activity happens in the residence hall. We provide not only a safe place to live, but also an environment for learning and self-discovery outside the classroom. Within our community, we hope to provide an intentional, meaningful, and beneficial experience that supports the development of our students. Through involvement in programs, living learning communities, RHA, community council, hall clubs, interactions with staff, conduct process, and so much more, we provide opportunities for our students to develop academically and personally. As for our community members, they are a group of diverse individuals who have joined us from all over the world. Our role is to provide an environment where students can interact and learn from one another in ways that respect each other's differences. By appreciating differences in our life experiences, identities, and self-expression, we confront barriers and biases. This, in turn, provides a safe environment for our community members to be themselves and to thrive. We also want our community to be inclusive. This can be achieved when our staff works in tandem to create and maintain an environment where everyone feels respected, valued, welcomed, and supported. When we can do this, we develop a sense of belonging. Take a moment to think about that. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong? How did that make you feel? And now I want you to think about how you will develop and protect this sense of belonging with your residents and your community. I hope you realize that even the smallest things matter and that you can have a powerful impact on an individual and the entire community. Now that we've talked about key aspects of our community, let's discuss potential threats to our community. Threats come in different forms and can happen at any time, day or night. We as staff members need to be prepared to address these situations when they arise. Throughout staff training and continual education, we will give you the knowledge and skills to address the most common threats. However, circumstances could arise that you're not prepared for, or maybe you're not sure how to handle. If this happens, you should contact a supervisor for support. We are a team, and we are here to support one another. So what are some of these threats to our community? Take a moment to think about that. What are some threats to our community? I will now list some of the most common threats to our community. This is not an all-inclusive list. For this presentation, I'm not going to go into detail about each of these threats or these topics because they're covered elsewhere in training. So here's my list of threats to our community in no particular order. Alcohol and drug-related behavior, disruptive behaviors, mental health concerns, theft or vandalism, safety and security issues, a dirty environment, either in community space or in student rooms, roommate issues, threatening behaviors, intimidation and/or harassment, sexual assault, physical harm, discrimination, obscene conduct. All these are threats, and there are many more. There is one more that most people don't realize is a threat, but poor staff behavior can be a threat to our community, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So now that we've identified potential threats, how do we protect and safeguard our residents and the community? And that will be what we will discuss going forward. So how do we safeguard our community and residents? Think about that for a minute. There are several ways that we can do this, but three main areas that we will focus on today will be the community standards of conduct. This sets behavior expectations for our community members. Next, the way staff engage with our residents, either through education of expectations or by addressing concerns in the community. And finally, the conduct process and the role it plays in educating our students and holding them accountable. Let's now look at these in more detail. Why do we have the community standards of conduct? I'll give you a second to think about that. Why do we have the community standards of conduct? The community standards of conduct sets behavior expectations for our community members and establishes a process for holding community members accountable for failing to meet those expectations. The community standards help to safeguard our residents and also physical property. It promotes an atmosphere that allows for meaningful interactions and positive relationships among community members. It allows us to provide an environment that is conducive to academic success. Keep in mind, the main reason our residents are here is for an education. We must provide a safe and peaceful home that allows for rest, study, and learning outside the classroom. It provides an atmosphere where students can be free to explore who they are and to grow as an individual. It also offers opportunities for students to learn from their mistakes if they fail. The community standards also supports our department's ability to create a dynamic learning experience where residents can explore their identities, connect their experiences to others, and achieve the necessary skills to become engaged citizens of the West Virginia community and global society. If you didn't already realize, this is our department's priority statement. So where do these policies and the community standards of conduct come from? They come from residence life and housing policies, and also the WVU Student Code of Conduct. All this can be found on the Housing and Residence Life webpage under policies. Let's now talk about staff engagement. First, let's discuss how all staff members have a role to play. All Residence Life staff members are vital to the success of our communities. We may have different roles, but we all engage our students in some form or fashion. These interactions can be formal or informal and can provide opportunities for learning and growth. When we engage our residents, We should always be professional and remember that our actions can have a significant impact on the residents and also the community. The actions listed here are some ways that all staff members can involve residents in potential learning. Interactions with residents. This covers a variety of areas from casually talking to a student in a hallway or striking up a conversation in an elevator. If you happen upon a situation where a student is on the verge of or planning to violate a policy, you should kindly remind them of the policy and give advice on how to avoid potential violations. For example, you overhear residents talking about being stressed over finals, and they are planning to drink wine in their room later tonight. You should remind them that alcohol is not permitted and that if they are found with alcohol in the residence hall room, they could be documented and held accountable. You could say something on the lines of, "Hello, I'm Phil, and I'm an RA in the building. Sorry to interrupt, but I happened to overhear you say something about being stressed and wanting to bring wine to your room. I don't want to add to your stress. I want to let you know that alcohol isn't permitted, and if you're found with it, you would be documented. I understand finals are stressful, so if you're interested, the Carew Center is hosting a program on stress reduction techniques. I can give you more information if you want." As you can see, a simple reminder can be a proactive strategy to address policy violations before they happen. Another way that staff engage residents is when a resident seeks support or asks questions. When this happens, we should do our best to provide an accurate answer, but if we aren't able to do so, we should seek support or provide resources that can help address the question. Sometimes, especially after an incident, the student may have questions about a policy or the conduct process. And you'll be able to answer their questions because you're going through this presentation right now. As staff, we also address community concerns and policy violations. When an issue is brought to our attention, we need to address it. We need to address it immediately. If we're not able to handle it ourselves, we should tag another staff member to help us with it. When addressing a policy violation, we should always explain why the situation or behavior is a violation, and then explain how to correct the behavior so that there are no further issues. Unfortunately, sometimes we may need to take more extreme measures and remove a student from the community. This and other incidents could have a negative impact. In these cases, we should follow up with the impacted individuals and provide additional support or resources. Now, let's take a moment to review additional strategies that resident assistants utilize to engage and educate residents. I won't go into detail because these strategies are covered in other training sessions. I still want to highlight that these strategies should be used to reinforce the community standards, expectations, and address important topics that are the reason for these expectations. For example, alcohol and drug-related behavior, sexual misconduct, harassment, discrimination, etc. We will now go into more detail about addressing concerns and violations in your community. When you approach. When approaching a situation, you should stay calm, or at least appear to be calm. Sometimes this takes mental preparation before approaching a situation. Before I go into a situation, and if I know what it is, I'll think about possible scenarios and how to respond. This helps me to be prepared to address the issue, and in turn, it helps me to stay calm. When speaking to those involved, you must identify yourself and share your name and position. When addressing the involved individuals, you should always be professional and assertive. Keep in mind, assertiveness does not equal being rude to the student. Respect, don't suspect. You should be respectful to the student that you're working with. Don't treat them like a suspect or a criminal. Also, don't let previous interactions with someone define how you interact with them now. You need to be conscious of your attitude and if you have bias towards the student or situation. You can't let this affect your judgment. If for some reason you're unable to be unbiased, you should ask another staff member to address the situation. Sometimes you will need to de-escalate the situation. There can be different strategies for each type of situation. That could mean a mediation between students, or separating them for a while so they can calm down, or maybe removing someone from the community. Those are just a few examples, but there are many more. You will go over additional strategies during behind closed doors and other parts of training. I should also say, if you ever need help to de-escalate a situation, you should call for support. Depending on the situation, it could be a fellow staff member, an RHC, or maybe UPD. Don't be afraid to call. Next, you should make the situation better and not worse. Do what you can to resolve the issue, but don't add to it or become an issue yourself. Returning staff have heard me tell this story before. I had a former staff member at a different school who had to address a student that was being disruptive. The staff member engaged the resident in a heated verbal confrontation, and this escalated the event. The staff member then made threatening statements to the student. As you can probably guess, this didn't help things at all. This staff member didn't make things better, but definitely made things worse. If you ever find yourself getting upset to the point of escalation and you can't calm yourself down, you should remove yourself and let someone else handle it. Finally, a general rule of thumb. You should assume that you are being recorded when you approach an issue. As most of you know, videos of situation are posted to social media all the time. You should always address situations and individuals appropriately, whether you know a camera is there or not. As with any incident, if you don't handle it appropriately, your supervisor will address it accordingly. You can also end up being TikTok famous, but not for a good reason. Identify the concerns. When there's an issue, you will speak to the involved individuals and explain why you're there. While doing so, you should identify how you learn about the issue. If it's a policy violation, you should identify the policy and explain why our community has this policy. Next, you should give guidance on how to correct the behavior to keep it from happening again. Finally, you should inform the student that the incident will be documented. And you should discuss next steps as it relates to any potential conduct process. When you address concerns or policy violations, there are things that you should avoid doing. Engaging in an argument with a student. If you are addressing an issue and the student is argumentative with no signs of stopping, you should walk away and document the situation and advocate. If the student becomes hostile and you have safety concerns, you should walk away and contact UPD about the student. Making threats. When you are speaking with someone, don't make threats about further actions. Avoid saying things like, if this happens again, UPD will arrest you, or you're going to get kicked out of the residence hall because you did this. Threats can be perceived as a desperate move, and if it's not backed up, the staff member loses credibility. As discussed previously, When talking about issues, you need to educate the resident about the topic and review potential next steps and consequences. Assumptions. When approaching situations and/or people, don't assume that you know what is going on or that you know the full story. You need to speak to those involved and get as many details as possible. When you report the incident, you should only share the facts and not assumptions. Also, don't assume you know a medical diagnosis and then share that assumption with the student. If a student is exhibiting symptoms of some kind, you should encourage them to see a doctor for a diagnosis and treatment. Do not diagnose them yourself. Targeting. You shouldn't target a student. Just because someone was involved with something similar in the past doesn't mean they are responsible this time. If you spend all your time focusing on one individual, you may miss the person who is actually responsible. It's also not good for the mental health of the student if they feel like they are being targeted. This is not an atmosphere that we want to create in our community. When you identify a responsible individual, you should have evidence that supports this conclusion. Taking sides. When working with residents that disagree with one another, you should avoid taking sides. You should stay neutral and hear both sides of the story without judgment. If you are perceived as taking a side, your ability to successfully work with the students and/or resolve the issue could be compromised. The student who thinks that you are not on their side may feel it's no longer safe to discuss the matter and close off communication. The other person who thinks you are on their side could use this perceived support to further justify their argument. Inconsistencies. You should avoid being inconsistent when addressing issues. If student A and B violate policy, they should be documented the same and addressed the same. Just because student A is your friend doesn't mean that you can let student A slide. This isn't fair to student B. This can also make it challenging for other staff members when they have to speak to student A about the same issue. When our staff are not consistent, students lose faith in our ability to appropriately address issues in the community. This will make you and our staff look bad. Making promises. Don't make promises that you don't have the authority to make. One example, if a student is involved in an incident, and from what you know of the situation, you believe the student will not be found responsible, you shouldn't promise that. There have been times where I always promised a student that they wouldn't be found responsible or get in trouble, but they didn't know the entire story. This will give misguided information to the student and will keep them from properly preparing for the conduct process. If it happens, it can be challenging for the conduct officer to have a meaningful conversation with the student. It also becomes difficult to help the student understand the error of their behavior. Personal bias. If for some reason you have had previous interactions with a student that has caused you to have a negative bias against them, and you're not able to put it aside, you should avoid addressing the student. Instead, have another member handle the concern. If this happens, you need to make your supervisor aware of your feelings. Sometimes staff members develop misconceptions about our role in the community. This can lead to dangerous practices that could cause harm to oneself and to others. Some misconceptions can lead to unhealthy behaviors that can negatively impact the staff member or the community. So I want to address those misconceptions so we don't cross into dangerous territory. Residence life staff are not the residence hall police, and the nature of our role is not law and order. Staff members shouldn't go around actively waiting for someone to break a rule or set up a sting operation to catch someone. Our purpose is to educate our residents about our community expectations, and if someone isn't meeting those expectations, we address it. If a situation arises that would require police support, we would contact UPD to come handle it. Next, we are not the social media police. You shouldn't actively go through each of your residents' social media accounts looking for a policy violation. This is not our role, and your time is better spent building relationships with your students. If you happen upon something, or if it's brought to your attention, you would then address it. This happens a lot with videos on Snapchat. Finally, staff are not above the policies. You're held to the same expectation as all residents. You need to set a good example and follow the rules. If your residents see you breaking a policy, they will think it's okay to do the same. This will make it challenging for you and other staff members to address their behavior. I should also say that if you see a staff member not following a policy, they should be approached and documented the same as any other resident. Staff support. You are not alone. Support is available if you need it. You should call someone if you need help addressing an issue, if you have questions, or if you don't know what to do. There's always somebody nearby to assist you. Who and when to call. You will go over this in detail in other parts of training, but I want to highlight it here to reinforce our support system. There's emergency services available 24/7. There is an RHC available for consultation and response 24/7. This includes building RHCs during regular office hours and the on-call RHC after office hours. There's an RHC on-call per campus. Also, there is an administrator on call 24/7. If you can't reach an RHC and it's after hours, you can call the administrator on call. If you haven't already done so, you will want to save these numbers in your phone. I now want to take time to explain the residence life conduct process. When you speak to students about what happens after an incident, they may ask you questions about the conduct process and what to expect. This part of the presentation will prepare you for those questions. As for the process itself, it can be a transformative experience for students. The conduct officer will help the student to learn from their behavior and try to make the incident a teachable moment. We also help the students to navigate their decision-making process in an effort to help them reflect upon their behavior and to learn how to make better decisions in the future. After participating in the conduct process, students will be better able to recognize how their behavior is inconsistent with community standards, describe what they need to do in the future to meet expectations, and explain the impact that their actions had or could have had on others and the community, define their personal values and how it played a role in their behavior, identify resources available in the university and Morgantown communities. The conduct process also meets our residence life learning goals. The student can gain awareness and understanding of who they are. One way that this is achieved is through the discussion and reflection that is had during the meeting and with the educational sanctions. The process will help the resident understand what it means to be part of the community and their role within the community, and also the impact of their actions on others. The process will also help the resident to develop skills and attributes which can lead to their own personal development, resilience, and independence. IR to case closed. This illustration shows the general flow of the conduct process from start to finish. It typically begins when a staff member or student reports concerning behaviors or possible policy violations. This information is put into a report, an advocate, and then initially processed by the Residence Life Office. During the initial processing, we will turn the report into a case and do an initial assessment of the documents. One document is the incident report, and if it's poorly written, we will send it back to staff members to rewrite. If UPD was involved in the incident, the police report is added to the case. Sometimes cases need to be reviewed by different offices, so appropriate referrals are made. The final step is assigning the case to a conduct officer. The appropriate assignment is dependent on the type of incident and if the student has any previous conduct history. The case could be assigned to an RHC assistant director, or sometimes the case is moved to the conduct office. Once a conduct officer was assigned to the case, they would do a case review. During this review, they will do the following. They will review the content of the reports and determine if any additional investigation is needed. This sometimes includes speaking to the reporting staff member or following up with witnesses. Next, they will review the case for any violations of the community standards of conduct or university code, and then apply corresponding charges. Then they will schedule a meeting and send the student a meeting notice that includes a list of the charges and the meeting information. The next step in the process is the conduct meeting. At the beginning of each meeting, the conduct officer will typically cover the following. Introductions. We try to get to know the student a little bit. This can give us insight into the student and tends to help the student to calm down if they are anxious. I typically ask them where they're from. How do they like living in the residence hall? I'll see if they're having any issues with their roommate or if there are issues with other community members. I also always ask about their future goals after they graduate from WVU. Next, we will do an academic review if it's appropriate. Prior to the meeting, we will check the student's academic record. If the student has poor grades, we will discuss the reason and also discuss academic resources. After the academic review, we will do an overview of the conduct meeting and see if the student has any questions before we begin reviewing the case. Case review and discussion. During this phase of the meeting, we will review the case documentation, reports, and other evidence. We will read out loud the report that you wrote. So please make sure that you are submitting good reports. It sounds really bad when we have to read a report with errors like poor grammar and sentence structure. Next, we will review any potential policy violations and corresponding charges. Then the student will be asked to respond to each of these charges. They simply say responsible or not responsible to each charge. After that, they will share their side of the story and give a statement. Then we will ask questions related to the incident and also ask questions to help us understand the reason behind the behavior. We want to understand the student's motivation behind their behavior and also see if there are any unknown circumstances behind that could be at play. This will then typically transition into an educational discussion, and this can be the most important part of the meeting. We attempt to help them learn from their behavior and to make it a teachable moment. We also explore the students' decision-making process to help them reflect upon their behavior and learn how to make better decisions in the future. We also discuss their future goals and how this behavior can affect the achievement of those goals. If you remember, in the introduction section, I said that I asked them about their future goals. I'll remind them of the response and then help the student to understand how their behavior can now negatively impact their ability to achieve their future goals. After the discussion, the conduct officer will do a final review of all information provided in the case and during the meeting. They will then use this information to make a decision related to a responsibility. We make our decisions based on the preponderance of the evidence. This is a standard of proof that applies to the student conduct proceedings or other determinations. It means that the evidence supports a conclusion that it is more likely than not that a policy violation occurred. If the conduct officer determines that the student is responsible, they will then assign appropriate educational sanctions. Educational sanctions include projects, meetings, or activities that are designed to help the student reflect upon their actions, learn to adjust their behavior, and in some cases includes reparations to the community. Once responsibility and sanctions have been determined, the conduct officer will send the student an outcome letter. This outcome letter reviews the results of the conduct meeting. If the student is found responsible, they have the right to appeal. And the appeal information is also outlined in the outcome letter. There are 3 reasons for an appeal, and this include: there is new information that was unavailable at the student conduct meeting and would change the outcome of the case. The student conduct meeting procedures were not followed, and the errors affected the outcome of the case. The outcome of the case is not supported by the preponderance of the evidence. As a result of the appeal, the appellate officer can uphold or modify the original decision, uphold or modify the behavior plan, and/or send the case back to be reheard or reconsidered. I should also note that while a case is on appeal, the assigned sanctions are on hold until the outcome of the appeal. So to recap this training, we just discussed 3 key methods that our department utilizes to safeguard and educate our community. First, the community standards of conduct that sets behavior expectations for our community members. Second, staff engagement with our residents, either through education or by addressing concerns in the community. And finally, the conduct process and the role it plays in educating our students and holding them accountable. My closing thoughts. The way we respond to student conduct symbolizes the community we aspire to be. And how we respond is key to our success in developing and maintaining thriving communities in our residence halls here at WVU. Again, if you have any questions, please follow up with your direct supervisor. This concludes this training presentation. Thank you for watching.